Welcome everyone to our panel today titled Rediscovering the Importance of Strategic Choices. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This year we are all over the place. My name is Arianna Marchetti and I'm an assistant professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School. And today I'm very glad to host this fabulous panel that I will introduce in a few minutes. And thank you very much for the Competitive Strategy Interest Group that is hosting this panel. So to set the stage about what we will be talking about, I just want to tell you very quickly why I chose this topic for the panel when I put it together and what I expect our panelists would roughly give us an idea about. So in the beginning, I was a little bit self-serving. So I work with individual level data. And I realized that when we study competitive strategy, we always had this view of the firm as a bundle of resources. And we look at this as a black box to understand how these certain things lead to performance. However, there is an ever-increasing availability of individual level data, including the one that I use for my research. I use text data generated by individuals within the organization to study corporate processes. And so I was really wondering to hear more by these people, whether this data revolution, in a sense, is giving us an opportunity to understand better how strategic choices are made. So my intention was really to understand better the people behind the strategic choices and strategic decisions, the managers within the organization. The second is a little bit of a controversial point. We talk a lot about AI and machine learning and the fact that a lot of jobs are being replaced by machines and algorithms. So the question is really, is there room for strategists within organizations, or should we envision organizations that are run by algorithms in a sense? I want to be a little provocative here and stretch the argument. And finally, this is an observation that really came out of my research in the past few years, is really we're observing industries that are much more uncertain and that evolve much more rapidly than they used to. And I mean, when I talk about uncertainty, I can just mention 2020, and I don't think I need to add anything to that. So the question is, given the speed at which industries and the world is changing and evolving, is there really room for strategy making, for strategic choices, and how should the people within the organizations make such choices and adjust to such volatile environments? So I really expect a conversation that is going to be about the rigor of academic research on this topic, and also how we can stay relevant to practitioners that need insights from us about this world. Very quickly about the housekeeping. So we will hear roughly half an hour of the panelists' point of view on the issue. So we will have 10 minutes each, and then I will open it for Q&As with the audience. In terms of how to run the Q&As, I would like to ask the audience to type your questions in the chat, directly in the Zoom chat, and I will take a look at that and kind of like moderate the questions and ask directly the panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce our fabulous panel here. I won't spend much words because there is really no need, and we'd rather hear from them. We have, in alphabetical order, Alfonso Gambardella from Bocconi University, Scott Stern from MIT Sloan, and Mary Dripsels from Boston College. First of all, thanks a lot for being here today with us, and the floor is yours. So I'll stop sharing my slides, and I guess Alfonso can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just make sure that I can share my slides. Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Excellent. So first and foremost, let me thank really Arianna and the organizers. I think this is a great topic, and it could not have been more timely to talk about these issues, because they are sufficiently interesting, sufficiently novel, sufficiently controversial that I think we can have a great and sufficiently important that we can have a great discussion. So let me I will really try to be efficient in my 10 minutes, so to leave room for the other speakers, of course, and for the discussion. I look forward to to the discussion in the second part of the meeting. So let me give you in a nutshell a line of relations that I think are relevant for what we could be discussing. So strategic choices matter. I definitely learned this also from Scott lately. Scott has actually emphasized this a lot. Strategic choices matter. I mean, the reason they matter is because at some point you have to make some commitment, and when you have to make a commitment, of course, you have to make choices. Because if we live in a world that was completely flexible, any choice I make can actually be resolved later on, and so without commitment, it's not even that important that you have to make choices. And of course, there has to be uncertainty, because if you have to make a commitment but there is no uncertainty, the choice of which choice you want to make will become actually important. And then my final link is probably the more controversial, which is, well, given that you have uncertainty, does it make sense to make predictions? Let me put it this way. In strategy, we really have different camps. We have people who believe that that predictions are important, and therefore the idea is yes, we have to have predictions because predictions actually help to make better choices. But we also have other people at the other extreme who basically say, no, the world is so complex that it's very hard to make any sort of prediction, and therefore strategic choices should actually happen in different ways. So what I would like to do in these remaining minutes is, let me make a small pitch for prediction, but with some important caveats and warnings. And I think, as Arianna was putting it very well, I mean, we live in a world where the use of data has become probably cheaper. And therefore, I think we need to ask these questions, exactly the question that Arianna was raising. Can we use this data for making predictions in strategy? And here I would really like to use this example from Scott's work, also because I have to confess that I'm using this example in my MBA and executive classes because it provides an excellent representation of the point I want to make. The question is, are predictions useful? Now, Jorge Guzman and Scott have this very interesting research in which they use zillions of data on, I think, all the Massachusetts startups for the past many years. And they show something that I think it's very intriguing, that essentially startups with shorter names are more likely to be high growth companies. And most interestingly, I have to say that I did a similar exercise with fewer startups in Italy, and it turns out that we have the same correlations in Italian startups as well. Actually, the startups with shorter names tend also to get more funding and grow faster. Now, this is a prediction that you can make using lots of data if you want. And it is useful if you are a venture capitalist, because you can use this as a way to predict whether the startup is going to be a high growth or not. But the big question is the one that we all know, I mean, as researchers. If you shorten your name, you are unlikely to grow faster. So let me put it this way, as a first statement. This may be a statement, this prediction may be very useful for people who need to predict and to exploit correlations. It is probably, as such, less useful if you have to make strategic choices, because strategic choices may not stem immediately from this kind of prediction. Unless, and this is really the point I want to make, unless you have a theory. Suppose that you have a theory, and here is the most trivial theory I could think of. Of course, I'm sure that there are many more elaborate theories about this. Shorter names are easier to remember by customers or by venture capitalists. So suppose that as a manager or as an entrepreneur, you actually have a theory and you test this theory, then the prediction actually becomes useful because it becomes a test of a theory and it informs your action. It can actually tell you that indeed, if you shorten your name, this is going to cause potentially higher growth. So I think the point I want to make, it's really this. The point I want to make is that if you want to understand strategic choices and you want to utilize predictions, sometimes these predictions can be useful by themselves if you are not the agent who is actually involved in the prediction. But if you are the agent who is involved in the prediction, in order to use these strategic choices to take actions, you need to have a theory behind the predictions you make. Let me give you another example I have from a real case. I was talking to a large utility company who actually used zillions of observations on their customers, and they found that customers who pay online are more reliable. They pay earlier and they're more likely to pay. And then we raised the usual question, what do you do with it? And you need to have a theory. So there are two alternative hypotheses. Those who paying online is easier, and therefore people are more reliable, or people who pay online are simply different people. Now, this is completely trivial to people like us who have been trained in endogeneity, causality, econometrics, instruments, experiments, and so on and so forth. It's not equally trivial to managers. And particularly, what is less appreciated is that teasing out these two alternative hypotheses have completely different implications for our managerial actions. Because if you tease out that it's easier to pay, then you want to diffuse online services. If actually the issue is different customers, you want to do something completely different, which is monitor customers. So again, I think this is a great example of the fact that whenever it comes to actions, then the prediction by itself is not enough. And again, I want to stress that this is something that sounds very natural to us as a researcher, but if we move from doing research to actual managerial practice, I think insisting on this point, that it's not just the data, but it's the way you understand the data, the way you read the data, the way you speak to the data, the way you frame the data that makes a difference. It's actually important. And particularly it makes a difference because it tells you which action you want to take. So what is the bottom line? In making strategic choices, managers need theories behind prediction. They are important to understand which actions. We have some good experimental evidence about it. The good experimental evidence is that actually managers or entrepreneurs who have mental frameworks, what we call a scientific approach to these decisions, actually perform better. And let me also give you this. In our analysis, we found that it is much easier to teach people to run a series of A/B tests. Our manager, our entrepreneurs understood immediately the way to run A/B tests. And actually they started to run several kinds of tests. Let me change the color, let me do this, let me do that. It was much harder to teach them how to formulate theories behind these tests in order to understand what the tests were actually telling them. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is, yes, you need theories and tests, very much like researchers, especially in a world in which using data becomes relatively easier and potentially helpful. I will just conclude with a few other things that are important issues I have discussed with quite a few people in strategy. Of course, there is night and uncertainty. So clearly, theories, tests rely on probability distributions. So it's really risk, it's not uncertainty. But at the same time, we have ways to deal with uncertainty, with night and uncertainty. We have ways to think about how to formulate probabilities and relations to blind spots or things like that. The other big thing is that, of course, strategic choices can be relatively simple, like the cases I have just suggested. Essentially, a manager has to choose against nature. Are customers good or bad? It becomes much more complicated when the strategic choice is about competitors, because the competitors actually react. I was reading a very good book recently by a data analyst who also stresses the storyboard theory, and he makes this point. When we make predictions about hurricanes, hurricanes do not respond to our prediction. They keep going as if we did not make the prediction. But when we make predictions about how people respond to pandemic, people actually change their behavior when they hear our predictions. And this makes the world even more complicated. But then he concludes by saying, well, still, good predictions can actually be helpful to make better choices. And of course, there is much more. I'll be happy to discuss this when we open the floor to broader discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfonso. A virtual round of applause for you now, and I think we can you can unshare and Scott can jump in.
So when Arianna sent around the topics and our job, I found that the question of does choice matter really was very clear, because there were sort of like answering her questions I thought was like an entire PhD seminar for many months, and we only have 10 minutes. So I loved Alfonso's comment. Thank you to Arianna and the organizers, to Mary, and to all of you. Thank you. I'm just going to hop right into this. And what I've tried to do here is I'm going to agree with very many things that Alfonso said. And I'm going to gently disagree in one area, because I think that one area where I'm not sure that even that he disagrees, I think is going to get to the role of strategic choice in competitive environments. So if you go on the internet, you will find, and you look up Michael Porter quotes, you will find that the main quote that has many, many things is Michael Porter many years ago saying the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do. And I'm going to make a claim as we go on that one quote, which is an incredibly powerful idea, has been largely misinterpreted. And so I'm going to sort of hit on that in the context of some of the work that I've been thinking about in entrepreneurial strategy. So what do we mean by choosing what not to do? And so one of my favorite examples is the early days of Amazon. Jeff Bezos was he was working in a finance firm and was given an assignment 2 years out of college. There's this thing called the internet. Where in finance will the internet affect finance? And he worked for 2 weeks and came up with a presentation and a little business plan. And he came up with something like E-Trade, and it was like it looked like it would be a money printing machine. And what distinguishes Jeff Bezos as a strategist, see, Arianna, I'm getting, Arianna asked us to define what a strategist was. What distinguishes Jeff Bezos as a strategist was that he didn't stop there. He realized that this was such a fertile area that he literally explored 20 different areas in depth before settling on books as the first best option, because it maximized the number of items available relative to the items in a physical store. Now, of course, and Arianna already, you're right, and Alfonso already sort of spoke to this, we know that that kind of crisp hypothesis with literally no interaction with the market is enormously rare. Most entrepreneurs, most companies learn by action. Exactly Alfonso's point just now is, you know, right? The chemicals fight back, right? Right? The experiment fights back. And I think it's useful to think about how little we know, even though we've made great advances in understanding when and how and what is the scope of effective learning and experimentation. For those of you who were at the panel a few days ago, I tried to make this contrast between Jennifer Hyman and Jennifer Fleiss, found in Rent the Runway. Tom Eisenman's excellent case on this. That's actually true. Having talked to the founders, it really is the case that they took a disciplined approach to learning exactly the process that Alfonso described, undertaking experiments and formulating a hypothesis about value creation for other people without making a commitment. And so you could go from making your prediction to resolving uncertainty to making the commitment, and that allowed them to make the strategic choice. Of course, the same words were used by somebody like Billy McFarland when he was doing the Fire Festival, in which he ended up just not being, this was some crazy idea to create a new kind of musical festival, and it was a total disaster, and he lost $20 million, and now he's in jail, okay? But if you look at what he said, he says, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm doing experiments. He wasn't doing an experiment. He had made a commitment, he just didn't realize it. And that commitment literally landed him in jail. Let me be clear what the issue is here, right? The issue is, in some sense, that most of the ways that we understand advice actually don't let us think clearly about the advice, the type of decision-making that's required when we face decision-making under significant uncertainty. Specifically, there's one kind of advice, and many of us throw out this advice all the time, which is you kind of know what you want to do, and there's the details of how to do it. So if you want to go and have a platform strategy, you can go and read Marshall Van Alstein's book, or you can read Annabelle Gaver's book, and they will give you the strategy for platforms once you've decided on what you want to do. Strategy in a kind of Porter or Teese or even RBV sense is largely about thinking about what the benefits and costs of alternative plans are, given my resources and capabilities and given the competitive environment, and optimize it. And to economists, I'm an economist, optimization and choice are basically the same word. But what do you do, right, when on the one hand, you can't do ex-ante cost benefit analysis, but you don't yet know what to do? And that was the topic of our Foundations of Entrepreneurial Strategy paper with Jane Wu and Josh Gans a few years ago, that the nature of the decision is itself different. If you have lots of options that you can surface, Jeff Bezos style, you can't do everything. You have to choose what not to do. You face real uncertainty of the type that Alfonso would tell you to resolve. And you can only do a limited amount of learning before you make a decision. That actually changes the kinds of experiments you should do themselves. Let me just, I don't want to go over time. I feel I have about 2 more minutes, Arianna. Okay. So in our entrepreneurial strategy work, that is kind of where this is the textbook with Aaron Scott and some of the HBR. That is the topic we try to resolve. And let me just sort of kind of highlight one key idea. Is that good strategic decision-making tends to have the feature that there are many ways to go that can work. By construction, if you are exploring a new market, if you're figuring out how to reorganize your business, if you're figuring out a new human resource strategy, if you're just figuring out the choices you're making in your platform design, should I show a picture or not on my Airbnb website of say the host or the guest? All of those choices are consequential, but if the underlying idea is good, it can work. And the consequence of that is that the nature of strategic choice is not going to be, oh, we know what to do and let's do that, nor is it going to be, we did economic or operations type optimization and there's a clear answer after our analysis. Instead, it's the nature that we know that we've done enough learning to identify that there are multiple ways to go, and we have to choose one rather than the other, at least for a period of time. Ultimately, strategic choice particularly as you get to kind of strategic choice for, say, a startup firm, is about choosing among alternative visions for an idea and company. So let me just kind of finish up. I have 30 seconds. I think I'm okay for 30 seconds. Is in our HBR article from a few years ago on strategy for startups, right? Those are very much focused on entrepreneurs, though I do believe that many of these ideas apply. But the one thing I would take away is that, for example, I had a student a few years ago, Socrates Rosenfeld, literally Army Ranger, dripping with medals, took all my courses, fantastic leader. And he came to my office about 3 years after he graduated, and he explained that he had identified an opportunity. Cannabis, which is rapidly legalizing, meets the internet, a tech approach to cannabis. And he and his founders sat there and they came up with dozens of potential directions. And they were aware of them. And many of the alternative consequences of businesses that then pursued the path that they didn't take then came to be, both the benefits and the costs that you could see. Why do I say that? I know we have a lot of junior researchers here. Strategy research needs to get serious about the choices not taken. Not in an economic sense to say that we deselected crappy alternatives, but what are the things that senior managers consider and say no to, not because they are not economically viable, but because they are strategically inconsistent. By taking the choices of entrepreneurs and strategists seriously, the work we're trying to do offers a framework for evaluating the ways in which the environment impacts startup growth and performance. So, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Scott. Perfect on time. And we have now Mary to close this first round before we open to the floor. Scott, can you unshare?
Yep.
Thank you.
So I think that both Scott and Alfonso would agree that under conditions of high uncertainty, if you don't have to make a commitment, then you generally wouldn't want to engage in making one. And so as the third speaker of this session, and I will say, we may appear to have an incredibly cohesive set of discussions, and I will thank the organizers for that by guiding us very nicely. I wasn't quite sure what Alfonso or Scott were really going to talk about. And therefore, since as the third speaker, I think part of my role is to reflect on what they have said. I didn't make a commitment, which would be putting together a set of slides. So instead, I have my usual handwritten thoughts, and I have on the fly, given the flexibility afforded me by no slides, adjusted some of these comments to reflect my thoughts on what Alfonso and Scott have had to say. So our first assignment was to think about how do we define what is in fact a strategic decision. And I think that is a really important starting point for all of us. In my view, I think a strategic decision is a non-routine decision that has a major impact on an organization's performance. So a lot of the things that we study in strategy that are following general heuristics and routines, I would argue, are not in any sense strategic. So pricing decisions in the airline industry where they go back and forth, and there are lots of great papers studying those interactions, and we call them strategic interactions. But in terms of the decision-making process of the managers involved, I don't think that's a strategic decision. That's we've been doing this for years. We understand how pricing in this industry works. We are executing. P&G comes out with yet another variation on Cheerios, and it wasn't just let's make them peanut flavored. Let's now make them, pumpkin spice flavored for Halloween, right? Those are not strategic decisions. Things like adding a new market for technology we have, making a major acquisition in a new area. Those are the kinds of things that to me count as strategic. So given that as a backdrop, then the question is, well, what does it mean to be a strategist in 2020, given all the kinds of things going on in the world? And so to me, and I think this is very much in line with where Arianna got us started, there are two sort of very broad global trends that I think are influencing how managers think about making these strategic decisions. And in my mind, the two are tools, meaning things like AI and other sorts of things that managers are using, not just for routine decisions, but for what I would call strategic decisions. And then the second overall trend has to do with the digital convergence and industry boundaries blurring. So let me talk for 2 seconds about each of those, and in my view, the implications of that for strategic decision making. So on the tools front, I'm going to give a quick shout out to a student of mine, Callan Anthony, who is now a professor at NYU. And Callan's thesis was looking at the use of tools by investment bankers. Now, the tools she was looking at weren't even AI, machine learning tools with neural networks where you couldn't possibly understand the mechanism that the tool is using. These are tools like FactSet and CapIQ, where there are a set of embedded assumptions in those tools that managers, if they are aware of it, can evaluate and know about. So the interesting thing to me in terms of what she found is, first, there's this phenomenon that in and of itself I found fascinating, which is, and some of you may or may not know this, FactSet and CapIQ, the two main tools used by all iBankers, globally to make predictions about valuations and, that drive M&A deals and such, right? Those tools make fundamentally different assumptions about major things like EBITDA, enterprise value, debt, right? And because of those different assumptions, they come out with materially different numbers for the exact same metric, for the exact same firm, right? So you would think, given that iBankers who are using those numbers to make major recommendations would know about those differences and have a purposeful way of thinking about, gee, if I want to use debt, I'm going to take the number from CapIQ because I like those assumptions better. I am consciously and purposefully choosing which tool to use. And what she finds that is fascinating is that, yes, there's one group, or actually it was two groups of within the same investment bank that took that approach to the tools. The other two groups that she looked at were completely unaware of the different assumptions that these tools made, right? They were affecting the decisions, but both the senior bankers and the junior bankers using the tools, when she'd show them the chart that says, gee, when I look at debt, CapIQ gives me this number, FactSet gives me this number, what's going on? This was an ethnography. She basically lived at this company for 7 months. The folks in that group would say, that must be a mistake. You must have, pulled the wrong numbers or something. That couldn't possibly be true, right? So what are the implications for that? And what she ends up looking at in her paper, and this gets to Alfonso's point of, okay, that's an interesting observation, but we need a theory of why this is happening and what's going on and what are the implications. So the thing that I thought was fascinating is, okay, given those two very different approaches, what about the outputs? And so she looks at the validating processes of each of these different groups, because an obvious question would be, well, then are the recommendations that we're getting out of this group that doesn't even understand what their tool is doing better or worse, right? And it turns out they are less predictable and reliable, but the senior managers have in their heads a set of kind of their own knowledge and heuristics about what makes sense. And so if something comes back and they're like, this doesn't look quite right, they don't necessarily have to understand the why. They don't know that it's, because the junior banker pulled the debt number from a different tool. Instead, they say, this doesn't make sense, go back and play with it, figure something out, and then they make corrections and adjustments. So what is the implication of that as we start to think about more sophisticated tools? We're never going to understand how neural networks come out with their predictions. It's just not something that the tool allows us to do, right? This is one of the more sophisticated machine learning tools. And so as managers, I think making sure that we can understand how to evaluate and validate outputs of tools that we won't necessarily understand is an important question going forward. So generally, I mean, yes, we can use these tools as researchers ourselves, and that was part of what Arianna was talking about initially. But I think in terms of how we think about the decision-making of managers, it's important for us to help them think about how they can use a set of tools that will black box certain things that for them might be important. And then as we get to this second overall trend, technical change resulting in all sorts of uncertainty in terms of industry boundaries, right? So this as a topic, digital convergence, has kind of been around forever, right? Michael Cusimano, I think, wrote some book chapter or one of his many books about it a long time ago. I would argue that that has now exploded to a level that it is beyond what any of us could have thought of years ago. So I'm doing some work now with a large telco, and they're completely panicked, and justifiably so, because people in the computing world, managers who are making strategic decisions, have decided that telecommunications should be part of computing. So Microsoft is buying telecom firms, and they're engaging in creating private communication networks through their own cloud, bypassing the public network, right? So if you're Verizon or if you're one of the firms that makes infrastructure, this is really not a happy development. So all of a sudden, I'm not just worried about competing with the other telco companies, I'm worried about communications or being taken over perhaps by computing firms. And then you could say, well, those kinds of firms, that's always kind of been going on. But look at the implications of that phenomenon for firms in traditional industries. The automotive industry is a great example. It used to be a car was a car, right? And it wasn't connected to anything. And now, Scott, you're voted in Massachusetts. I'm not sure what you voted on Proposition 1 about should we open up the car platform in order to let anyone access the data of the car. Now, cars are internet devices, right? So the Internet of Things, this notion that all of these things floating around are going to be connected to the internet, has completely transformed a gazillion traditional industries. So, I have my coffee cup here. It's not currently connected to the internet, but I guarantee you someone's going to make a coffee mug that will help figure out how often I drink my coffee and automatically reheat my coffee if it's been too long, right? So all of these managers in traditional industries are having to think about this. All right, so let me quickly move on to the last two things that I wanted to talk about. Being a good doobie, I followed the guidelines of the questions. So we were asked to talk about what's one important thing that we've learned about the people involved in these strategic decisions, and then what's something that we'd want to learn. So to me, I have resisted over the years at a deep level getting down to individuals, right? So even the work that Giovanni Gavetti and I did at Polaroid, we were looking at the top management team and these shared mental models of the team and how that mattered. And more recently, Tiona Zuzul and I have a paper that came out in ASQ a few months ago looking at individual level founder identity and how that had an incredible impact on what Scott would call, the alternative visions of an entrepreneurial firm. And so we have founders that we call revolutionaries, for whom, to them, the meaning of being an entrepreneur means I want to change the world. If I can start a company and experiment and make a ton of money, but I don't change the world, I have failed. And that individual identity has a serious and major impact, therefore, on how they approach the industry, the kinds of commitments that they make, the strategies they engage in. And the other kinds of founders that we looked at are what we call, I think we ended up calling them discoverers in the end. Those of you who've been in a review process know how labels change over the course of a paper. These are folks for whom being an entrepreneur doesn't mean change the world, right? It means I'm going to start a company that makes a bunch of money. And so they do all the things that we tell managers to do. They experiment, they run hypothesis testing and such, right? So the notion that individual level identity has a major impact on firm level strategic decisions, to me, is a super important thing that at one level it sounds obvious, but it's not the sort of research that we typically have engaged in as we think about strategic decisions. The people do tend to be behind the scenes. What do I want to learn about? I want to learn more about the persistence of individual level mental models based on the history people have in organizations. So what do I mean by that? Mary Benner and I have this paper from SMJ in 2012 where we showed that firms coming from different prior industries interpreted digital photography very differently, right? And even though we talked about the mental models of the managers in those firms, right, we had no data on the individual people. We were simply assuming, the reason that Sony thought about a camera as a consumer electronic is because those managers have been in that industry forever, right? And so as we start to see this huge change where telcos need to start thinking about competing with computing firms, and if I'm in the automotive industry, I can't think about a car as a car, and everyone wants to open up platforms, right? To me, it would be super interesting to actually, at the individual level, be able to look at just how much our managers who've spent 20 years building telecom infrastructure able to shift their mindset and actually take into account what's happening in the world. And then lastly, we were supposed to give advice to PhD students on if they wanted to study this, what would they do? So my 2 pieces of advice are, number 1, before you start doing anything, actually pick an angle, pick a literature, and understand what's been said about it. So in terms of strategic decision making, so I would argue that Scott and Alfonso and I at this point we read each other's papers. Even though I am not firmly in the economics of innovation literature, I am knowledgeable about what's going on there, and I'm going to argue vice versa. I think both of you, despite being hardcore economists, occasionally actually cite papers of mine that are talking about cognitive processes, right? I do think as a PhD student, you need to pick a camp initially, your primary audience, and then you can say things that are building on what the other audiences have said. But I think pick a camp, understand what's been said, and then spend some time in the field talking to managers. So I am big on being phenomenon driven, but to me, that doesn't mean, just go out and look at what people are doing and see what's interesting. In order to find out what's interesting, you need to understand what other folks have said. What are the predictions of the literature? And then are you observing something that doesn't quite fit with that? And then that kind of anomaly will drive research. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. A round of applause virtual for all of you. So I would invite the audience to start typing in the chat whatever question they would like to ask the panelists. I would first like to ask if the panelists, you have like reactions for each other's, or if not, I have a couple of things that I would like to get started with. I go ahead. Yes,
Can I
go
just
ahead.
quickly say something very quickly? No, I just want to make one point, because based on Scott's discussion, I just want to clarify one element. I mean, the point I try to make, of course, is not that here it's a top-down approach in which you have a schematic representation of the world and then you optimize choices. I'm completely with Scott on the idea that the world is complicated. And my point is simply that mental representations with evidence-giving feedback are helpful to drive a path. That's the point. But I'm completely cognizant of the points that he makes, and I'm completely for an opportunity creation world as opposed to an opportunity discovery world.
Thanks, Alfonso. Okay, so I have a question from Mary. And I mean, I'm going to shorten it. It's a quite long one, but it's about the relationship between strategic choices, the founders, and kind of like the organizational identity. So what's the relationship and the interplay among these, and how those affect each other? Because if I read the question correctly, kind of like when you make a decision about your organizational identity and how you're going to pursue your goals, you make a choice that is going to be harder to change. You're committing to your people as a manager to be a certain type of organization. So how do you see this interplay here?
So I think the set of relationships that gets you from founder identity to a certain strategy with or without different levels of commitment goes through a set of strategic choices, right? So because I think about myself as a certain type of founder, I want to change the world. that and the founders do in the early stages of companies have way more, I would argue the founder identity and the organizational identity are very much intertwined. The founders have an inordinate level of influence, right? And so the strategic choices that are made get driven by the founders or set of founders, right? And then those choices might or might not involve commitment to particular strategies. So that to me is what was sort of interesting in this bifurcation we saw that industry with air taxis, is that revolutionary founders made firm level commitments that were difficult to reverse to a particular model of what air taxis would look like, to specific types of aircraft, to software that they spent $20 million on to optimize a particular business model, right? And so for different types of founder identity led to choices that involved either commitment or lack of commitment. So the Discoverer founders consciously said, we are going to be about flexibility and morphing. We aren't defining ourselves in any particular way. We aren't necessarily an air taxi company. We could be a charter company. So flexibility in some sense was inherent in a lot of the strategic choices that they made. And it just so happened that in this industry, we had a financial crisis in 2008. So the flexible strategy was the better one. And that company is still around today. If we hadn't had a financial crisis, if this industry had grown, one might argue that the commitment-based strategy is more defensible, and that would have been a more successful approach. So I don't have a point of view as to which type of approach is better. It depends, but hopefully that answers the question, right? We go from founder to choice, which affects the organization at a broader level.
Okay, and of course, the other panelists, whenever you want to jump in, just give me a sign, so I'll stop. I'm going to bundle together a bunch of questions that popped up in the chat and also in my mind while I heard you speaking, which is, I think it speaks about how, as researchers, are we going to study strategic choices? So I think this really came up to my mind when Scott concluded his little speech with saying the importance of choices not taken and as because strategically inconsistent. Before even getting to the strategically inconsistent, how do we observe choices that are not taken, right? If we assume that we are interested in strategic choices, the more lower level behavioral elements might be easier to observe, but these choices are costly. So how do we observe it first? Second, someone in the chat is mentioning maybe there is no other way than just formal modeling to understand these choices because of this issue. And finally, should we expect, due to the diffusion of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on, that is going to help managers making decisions, should we expect less heterogeneity in the strategic choices that we are going to observe? And in a sense, given that these tools are equalizing the cognitive ability to process the data, are the differences we're going to observe mostly being driven by just behavioral differences, the founders' differences that you were pointing at? So I bundled it all together. Just feel free to share your reactions.
So do you want me to start? Maybe I can start. So great question. So first and foremost, I think that it's possible to see choices not taken. And Mary, what she just talked about in her study of the revolutionary, and I can't remember the other type of founder, the different categories used, but what they do in that paper, and she's done in a bunch of work, is to really, mostly using qualitative methods, but really looking at individual founders and their stories, and basically then aggregating from that and saying, there were a few different approaches. Strategy does have structure. There are, in other words, if you buy into Mary's first point, that we're talking about non-routine decisions, there are only, maybe a collection of, there isn't 1,000 things, even if Jan might be in the audience, right? It's a few big things that you have to get right, and then a lot of things you can iterate on. And so, in our entrepreneurial strategy textbook and some of our work, we actually come to a view of what those choices are and what the alternatives are. And specifically, we have one paper in Industrial and Corporate Change that was in honor of Nate Rosenberg, where we use, this is with Kenny Ching and Josh Gams, where we look at, does the founder identity matter if it's a student or a faculty member in a tech startup? And it turns out that the faculty, not surprisingly, go slow and get a lot of IP. And for ideas that are econometrically equivalent, the students kind of run off campus and just start doing stuff, even though the underlying ideas are as, quote unquote, as patentable. Jorge Guzman is doing some very interesting work on measuring founding strategy that's kind of in that line. I would claim that first order evidence that takes a view on what the strategic options were, but dismisses the idea that you could have ranked them well in advance. Like, it's not just optimization, but looks at, like Mary did, is it founder characteristics matter? Is it, and so in the paper that was in Honor and Nate, what we make is a very simple point, is that so often, and this is almost like a effectuation type point, really small stuff at the beginning massively shifts the firm. Well, when you think about it from a kind of Porterian strategy perspective, the small stuff shouldn't matter. I mean, you're talking about, you know, these are going to be billion-dollar companies, you know, raise some money. But the point is that by and large, people are highly influenced by relatively small near-term prompts. And one can leverage that along with choices not taken to do concrete research.
Can I add something, Arianna? Let me add one thing to this discussion, and going to the issue of strategic choices, because I think this is really the core of the issue. And let me be very inductive at this stage, based on experience they had in the past few years of talking to many entrepreneurs and also managers and so on and so forth. Sometimes we have this representation as if entrepreneurs or managers have a clear idea of what the strategic choices are. What I actually realized is that on many occasions, these people did not even identify what the strategic choices are. I think this is an important point. There is also a point in the chat on what are the antecedents of strategic choices. I think framing the problem in such a way that you identify potential alternative choices, it's already an important dimension of the problem. And I think it should also be part of our understanding of how strategic choices are formed. And just to add one more piece on this, I noted this with entrepreneurs, but sometimes I noted this also with managers of larger companies. So it's not just a general issue. So my point is, and here Teppo Fellin and Todd Zenger have lots of work on this, framing the problem well, it's already a big issue that I think we should understand better.
Thanks, Alfonso. Mary, anything to add on this?
I mean, I will, since we only have 7 minutes left.
Yes.
Why don't you see if there are other questions?
Sure. So there is something that I want to bundle with a point I want to raise on uncertainty. So Scott, apparently you were on another panel before making a difference between entrepreneurial and incumbent strategy. And this to me speaks a lot also about the uncertainty. It's something that we have touched upon, but I want to ask this question about both for practitioners and research, right? Do we see much less theory building these days in our field because we have just exhausted the theories, or because of the uncertainties we're facing, right? In a sense, when you have so many boundary conditions that shift so often, how much of a theory can you build that can be generalized and be meaningful? And on the other side, also for practitioners, you all spoke about learning by action, awareness, importance of theory in making sense of your reality, but how much is this possible when you have such a volatile environment? And this brings me to the point of entrepreneurial versus incumbent strategy, because entrepreneurs face, of course, much more uncertainty than the one that is already in the environment that everyone confronts. So if we can reflect a bit on this point.
So, okay, do you guys want me to, can I go, or do you want to? Okay, yeah. So, great, fantastic question. Let me say this. I'm going to actually gently disagree with something you say. I actually think that for true competitive advantage, really outsized performance, there is a lot of theory making going on. If you, for those of you who have looked at the organizational processes of Amazon, every single meeting, it is like Mike Porter would sit there and be very comfortable. Everybody has to write a memo in advance. Multiple options have to be listed. It's like a whole, getting the memo to Jeff is the point of being a senior employee at Amazon. Google, which is a company I know well at a senior level, that is a company that is enormously analytically driven. They test everything they can, and then they do make big strategic bets, but they're also thinking about hedging. I think that, and once again, there's lots of, there are some counterexamples, but in a world where, I think it's 10 companies in the United States, all in the tech sector, are worth more than the entire market capitalization of all public markets in Europe. It sort of gets to this point, and almost all of them are enormously strategic, right? There's a great new article in the HBR just this month from Joel Bocconi and what's his name? On Apple's internal process.
Morten Hansen.
Yeah, and I would just, and let me just say, I think that the strategy field the competitive strategy field has massively underestimated how much strategic decision making there is in large organizations these days. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I have 5 other things to say, but I also want to leave time.
I'm going to jump in and just also say, I'll take issue with the last thing you said, which is that, entrepreneurial firms face more uncertainty than incumbent firms. That at some level might have been true historically in certain industries, but back to my coffee mug example, I think that at this point across the board, large established firms that have been very successful at having a level of competitive advantage are facing a completely different world between the higher level of connectivity and the use of AI in ways that we can't even begin to predict. And so I actually think that the level of uncertainty for large established firms is just as high, and in a way is more difficult to deal with if they have a long history of being able to make more routine strategic decisions that have been effective.
Thank you, Alfonso. Any reaction?
I think, I completely agree with what Scott and Mary said. I think this story of the strategic decisions is becoming more and more important because of the availability of data, because of the increasing uncertainty, and because of several other dimensions. I really think this is an area where we need to understand better. Many of us speak and recognize the importance of Knightian uncertainty, but I also think that we need to understand better how actually decisions are made under Knightian uncertainty, not just under conditions of risk. And this is definitely another important point. The pandemic has clearly made this apparent. In my country, when things actually started, it was complete Knightian uncertainty. And so we really see Knightian uncertainty in action. People had no clue about what to do. And they made some kind of choices. So definitely that is another area where I think we need to understand things better.
Okay, in the last minute, we have actually one question that is unanswered in the chat. What's the role of institutional environmental influences on entrepreneurs' strategic choices among the various drivers that we can observe? This would require another couple of hours, but in 1 minute.
The iron cage.
God, why did you fade out?
Oh, sorry.
Up your camera.
Oh, my hold on, guys. Okay, you guys talk. Sorry, my camera came out. There we go. The iron cage is broken out of more than it used to be.
This sounds very philosophical.
It was philosophical. Let me say, can I say one different thing? which is the two best books I've read in the last year on these topics have seemingly nothing to do with the strategy field. One is the book If Then by Joe Lepore, The History of the Simulmatics Corporation, which is the best book I've ever read about the folly of thinking that we can predict things. It's a just totally forgotten story, and it is very profound, and she's a profound historian. And the other book is, I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but it is called The Biggest Bluff. It is by a student of, it was by a Columbia PhD student who then was a writer for the New Yorker, who became a professional poker player, but brings behavioral insight to becoming a World Series of Poker player. And it is one of the most compelling books I've ever read about the nature of strategic decision making. So those are my book recommendations.
Thank you for sharing.
On this topic.
I'm aware of time and that it's been a long Zoom day. So unless Mary and Alfonso have some other very important reactions, I would the panel go.
I'm just impressed that Scott is reading something other than junky fiction. The most impressive thing I've read lately, not impressive, but interesting, is Trevor Noah's memoir, which isn't quite in the league of, and the last time Scott made a book recommendation, it was Jill Lepore's other book on the history of the United States, which I did go and buy per Scott's recommendation, but it's really thick.
Yeah.
So
the most important thing I want to say is really to thank you, Arianna. I think this is a great topic. It's a very important topic. And I really hope that to see more of this in the future. And thank you for organizing this.
Thank you so much. This was fun and it was a very, very nice discussion. So a virtual applause for you, and I hope we'll see you in person next year or earlier.